Thank you so much, Janelle, and to all of the SIP family. It is an honor to have been invited back to be with all of you today. I'm enjoying looking at the participant list. I can't see all of your names, but right now, 240 plus committed educators. So I am in my favorite place with my favorite kind of people on the planet. I'm really excited to have been invited to share my perspective on student behavior. In my work as a special education professor, a teacher educator, my work is focused on supporting inclusion. And so from my perspective, I refer to it as neuro inclusion, which means helping educators, therapists, counselors, and really any kind of child-facing professional to understand what we need to proactively do to support the thriving of children who have diverse types of diagnoses or exceptional needs or behavioral concerns. So many times when I am leading professional development, and many of you professionally may feel the same or have experienced the same, we're asked, give me tips and tricks and strategies for what to do when children have a meltdown or when they're refusing to cooperate or behave. So the question is usually always about what to do after we've experienced strong behaviors from children. Our work takes a different lens. And rather than focusing on what we can do to quote unquote regulate, because that seems to be a big word in the field, people want to regulate children's behaviors and nervous systems. One thing I want to start on that, this idea of regulation is very mechanical. So it's like we want to turn a child's nervous system like a dial in order to turn them up to get more active and excited about learning, and turn the dial down to help them settle. But what we are looking at is attunement, which is more relational. And what we have found is that the best way to actually support and to reduce the occurrence of strong behaviors is for the adult's nervous system to be ready to offer attunement rather than regulation through carrots and sticks and behavior strategies. So in my work with teachers, we focus on the adult nervous system and really looking at what we do and understand about our own nervous system capacity to create the types of environments where children can thrive and where behaviors are minimized. So I'd love to dive into this time with you. So I'd like to spend this time talking to you about cultivating the adult's nervous system capacity for co-regulation and connection, particularly for neurodiverse learners. So I'd like to start out by giving a shout out to a group of strategy keepers that I had the pleasure to work with for about 5 years at Berryessa Union School District in San Jose area. Their work with this project has been instrumental in helping us study and test and research over a period of 3 years of research conducted within a 5-year engagement, the impact of centering adult nervous system capacity in supporting reductions in expulsionary discipline, reductions in referrals to the office for disciplinary action, as well as referrals for special education, because with this lens and approach, we see greater capacity for educators in being able to support neurodiverse children in the general education classroom, which we are exceptionally proud of, reducing the amount of marginalization that neurodiverse learners experience. So in case there's anyone from Berryessa on the line today, I want to give a big shout out. The work we do, as you see, they're all holding here pictures of the human brain or models of the human brain that they created from clay. Our work is grounded in applied educational neuroscience, meaning we take as the foundation a deep dive and understanding of the human brain and nervous system and how that creates the foundations for bottom-up learning, which is what we advocate and are suggesting that we all really grasp for our personal role in supporting behavior. So much of behavior and academic instruction in our culture is delivered with a top-down model in mind, this idea that we are speaking first and connecting first with the cognitive frontal lobe part of the brain, where we're opening up the brain like a cranial can opener with a cranial can opener and pouring in content and instruction that tells the mouth what to say and hands what to do and telling butts to stay in their seat. But what we really understand from applied neuroscience is more in alignment with Bruce Perry's neurosequential model, which helps us understand that children are not, none of our brains actually are oriented to be primarily focused on absorbing instructions about reading, writing, arithmetic, or behavior management. Instead, our brains and nervous systems are oriented to orient toward a sense of safety. And the first priority before being able to engage meaningfully in learning is to be oriented to both physical and psychological safety. So that sense of emotional safety and comfort within the environment, the physical environment, as well as within the relational connection with the adults in charge. And after that foundational base brain level need for safety, we move forward to support the midbrain's need for relational care and belonging. This ability to have rituals of connection within a classroom between teacher and student that help them feel settled, which so many of our SEL programs do aim to provide. And what the research is showing us is that unless and until we have that foundational need met for physical, psychological safety, that sense of emotional connection and belonging, only then do we have access to the level of emotional control and regulation that allows us to access the reasoning and learning centers of the brain. And without them, the brain is more reactive to survival state. So activating somatic survival responses of fight, flee, freeze, or appease, which many of you are familiar with. But this is not only true for the student, but it's also true for teachers. And so here we want to continue on to help us understand that as it relates to grounding that sense of felt safety for students, we don't just look at external mechanisms of behavioral control. We have to, again, look back at the adult's nervous system state. So research is consistently showing us that adults can either co-regulate or co-escalate children's behaviors. And many times we are the antecedent to many of the strong behaviors that we are observing with children. And we understand from our approach that in order to optimally support pro-social behavior, we have to honestly reflect on our own nervous system. And out of the research that I've done with teachers for many years, and especially going deep with Berryessa Union for 5 years of our project, we came up in our research with 3 fundamental questions that we need teachers, counselors. We also do this work with paraprofessionals, with people who drive buses, with people who are responsible for yard duty, all of the professionals who interact and engage with youth. 3 questions that we have to ask that help shape our own nervous system. In our work, we're consistently asking child-serving adults, what is my own ACE score? So we'll break that down in a minute, but for those of you who are not familiar, ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. So what's my own trauma score? We'll tie into that in a moment. The second question I ask adults to answer as they prepare to build nervous systems that are ready to provide stable support for children's behavior is, am I myself neurodivergent? So what I have found in a lot of my work as a special education professor, is that many of the teachers I train, because teachers and counselors are my students, is that there's a significant population of neurodiverse adults who serve children. So many adults that I serve that have autism, ADHD, dyslexia, mental health diagnoses that serve us well in being able to bring our lived experience to supporting students, but without awareness of how those features of neurodiversity affect our instructional style, our relational style, as well as our discipline style with children. Sometimes we are not aware of the mismatch between our own nervous system's needs and the needs of the children that we serve. So we'll explore that in a minute. And the third question that I ask all of my teachers to explore and to answer for themselves is how does implicit bias impact my ability to provide co-regulation? So we're going to take a look at that from a nervous system perspective as we move through this journey. All right. So the first question that I ask educators to explore as they begin to commit themselves to building nervous system resilience to support student behavior is to explore, how does my own nervous system respond to perceived threat? So the interesting thing, there's a lot of research that shows that teachers' physiological stress states and burnout levels, and which is reflected in elevated cortisol, which is the stress chemical that we all have in abundance in our bodies when we are in fight, flight, or any type of survival state. And so research is showing us that when teachers are given a burnout test score or a stress test, they measure children's cortisol levels with saliva tests. At the door, when they come in the morning, they check them again at midpoints throughout the day and at the end of the day. And what they consistently find in the research is that teachers who have less stress resilience and higher levels of cortisol in their own bodies, those heightened cortisol levels are reflected in the children's own saliva tests. So what we understand from a neuroscience perspective is that when cortisol rises, that begins to compete with the brain's ability to engage higher level executive functioning, which includes time management, memory, impulse control, pro-social behavior, task initiation, organization and planning, all of the types of academic behaviors that we're hoping for children to demonstrate in the classroom. So it's for this reason in our work that we are very committed to having mind-body wellness and nervous system support approaches for educators. You know, so many times we have SEL programs, mindfulness programs in the classroom that we direct toward children. And many times, often those breathwork programs or mindfulness programs, they're almost, I would say, weaponized in a way. Okay, Johnny, you're not paying attention. Go over in the corner or go in the calm space and breathe. And then when you calm down, you can earn your right to come back and be in community. What this research shows to us is that this idea of wellness, this idea of nervous system support, is for the communal aspect of an entire classroom, which should necessarily include the educator, him or herself. Again, as we do practices of this type, it helps bring down that cortisol expression, not just for the children, but for the teacher as well. So in our work, we find that there's been a big push to understand children's ACE scores. Their adverse childhood experience study that was conducted in the late 90s by Kaiser Permanente and the CDC. Many school districts across the country made strong initiatives around understanding children's ACE scores to predict behavior, to predict concerns around health or at-risk behaviors. But in my work as a teacher educator, I began to understand that it wasn't as important for teachers to know children's ACE scores, but that it was more important for a teacher to reflect on their own ACE score and how what they may have experienced in childhood or even up to today that may have been experienced and registered in their nervous system as a traumatic experience actually rewires the nervous system over time and potentially impacts how they show up in the classroom for children. So the study looks at 3 different types of ACEs, be it abuse, neglect, what they are referencing as household dysfunction. I would have chosen a different word, but this is the literature I want to stay with there. And what I have found in my work as a professional is that helping professionals tend to have higher ACE scores on average than adults who choose other professions. So for example, when I'm working with school counselors, any kind of mental health professionals, teachers in general, but special education teachers even more, tend to on average have higher ACE scores. We see more burnout. So I want to just also share when I get to that, what kind of experiences could that be? So you can see here above the tree, The adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, stands for things that a person may have experienced in their home life, from, again, childhood, birth to adulthood. But there was some pushback within the research that said, well, there are other things that could be experienced or registered in a nervous system as a trauma. I may not have had any kind of abuse or neglect in my home environment. So the Philadelphia Expanded ACEs study came up with another term called the adverse community environments, looking at things like poverty, discrimination, lack of opportunity or social mobility, but also communal or community-wide experiences like the Altadena fires that devastated the community where I raised my children. Things like the pandemic that many of us have registered, adults as well as children, as trauma in our collective nervous system. Floods, hurricanes, war, things that completely disrupt a community can be registered in the nervous system as a traumatic experience that can have lasting impact for some in their nervous system state. So when I started in my work asking teachers to, or not asking and inviting them to take the ACE test, to begin to explore how does my instructional style reflect my nervous system stressors? How does my relational style, whether or not I'm comfortable accepting hugs and touch? So in some cases, I've worked with teachers who, based on traumas that they or stressors that they have been through in their life, are not able to enjoy physical touch, whether they have had a trauma history that makes touch uncomfortable, or whether they have a neurodiverse diagnosis where they have a strong sensory sensitivity to touch. And if they got young children reaching out for hugs when they need help to co-regulate to settle a behavior, the adult may push them away because their own body profile is not comfortable receiving that touch or that attachment in that way. Then we see a child's behavior escalate and we see meltdowns, but the adult is not always thinking that their inability to connect and co-regulate with that child with touch played a part in that subsequent meltdown that led to punishment or behavioral intervention. So a lot of our work helps adults to begin to explore that. But when we began asking and inviting teachers to either look directly at the ACE test and take the test, or to just consider their own survival responses, we found that educators who had higher ACE scores were more likely to have a more authoritarian discipline style. They were more likely to engage in exclusionary discipline practices of kicking children out of the class, or experiencing career burnout because their nervous systems may default more to a fight or flight mode when they are working or struggling with children's behaviors. Some adults that learn to survive through appeasement, or tend and befriend, often registered having more of a challenge with having healthy boundaries with students. So if their survival profile was to go along to get along growing up, then they're more likely to have a strong need to appease children and to be liked by them. So holding boundaries and having strong, we would call it a warm demander, where you can still be warm and connected with students, but you hold a strong line of expectation and of the behavior requirements. Those teachers that have a more difficult time doing that because their nervous system has a stronger default need to be liked and to appease, had harder times with boundaries with students. So in our work with teachers, we have them look at that ACE score and then begin to reflect on that. So what I would ask you all while we're here for a moment, and we will have time to chat in the debrief time and quick Q&A time, but I'd like you to just take a pause for a moment and think about how your teaching style or your leadership style is reflective of how your nervous system learned to respond to stress or trauma, big T or little t trauma. So just take a note on that for yourself, and we will have time to come together at the end. And before we move on from here, I'd just like to share just a brief version of a story about one teacher that I did this process with in our training. And she took the test and saw that her ACE score was 10 out of 10. And this is a second grade teacher, a late career professional who had a strong history of a lot of expulsionary discipline, kicking children out of class and sending them to the office for behavior. And primarily Black and brown children, primarily boys in the second grade. And when she reflected on her trauma score and her attachment style, her instructional style, and her discipline style, what she came to realize was that in her own upbringing, the household was so chaotic that the only time she felt safe and settled was when everything was quiet and when everybody was still. And so she brought that nervous system need that she had for stillness, for strict control of her environment into the classroom. So she reflected and realized that as a second grade teacher, she never had craft type of activities, cooperative, collaborative types of activities, anything where there would be mess or noise or crayons or children up out of their seats moving around. Because in her experience, anytime there are sounds or noises coming from behind her that she cannot register, it triggers her nervous system to a state that she is feeling out of control. So if you can imagine, again, her attachment style, she found it difficult to hug and touch students or to have them needing connection with her physically. She found it difficult to run a developmentally appropriate classroom for second graders that would involve manipulatives and arts and crafts and movement. And because she was highly triggered in a mobilized survival state, she would kick students out when they competed with her nervous system's need for strict control. So that led to excessive disciplinary measures in the classroom. But as she came and reflected on this piece, she began a journey of applying mind-body practices, mindfulness, breath work. She took it upon herself to get counseling and therapy and somatic practices that supported her nervous system strength. And now a few years later, her discipline discipline action for suspending and sending children to the office is down 85%. And she now manages her classroom, and her nervous system can now handle more of the natural rhythm and activity and laughter and movement of children without it triggering stress states for her. So this is something that we all as teachers need to be aware of. And if it's not something that's explicitly brought up, we just think these kids from this neighborhood don't know how to behave, right? So it's easy to blame those kids because they're from that poor community or they're from that ethnicity or they have those learning disabilities. That's why they're behaving that way and I'm kicking them out. But again, without this reflection on how the adult nervous system state is impacting that classroom environment, we don't get to see that there is true antecedents that the adult has control over. All right, so let's move on. This second question that I'm always asking teachers to reflect on, all child serving professionals to reflect on, is am I neurodivergent? And how does this impact my teaching style? Now, this point came to me after many, many years of teacher professional development and teacher education, because what I found in this work was that so many adults, as I taught inclusive classroom practices, began to reflect back to me, Dr. Niki, based on these profiles you're giving us to understand the needs of neurodiverse students with autism, with ADHD, with dyslexia, I think I might have it. So many adults are actually underdiagnosed, particularly women. And since the majority of our teaching force are women, we understand in the science, in the research, that many women are underdiagnosed because our symptoms for things, especially like ADHD and autism, present differently than they do in males and in men, young boys. And so what we began to explore is understanding certain features of the neurodiverse nervous system impacts, again, how a teacher would design their classrooms, understanding a teacher's own sensory sensitivities, and understanding the teacher's own stressors that make it challenging to be able to have a greater window of capacity to support children who are having strong behaviors. So let's take a look. In our approach to mind-body support in the classroom, we understand that the key thing that's needed for prosocial behavior and for optimal learning is something called high vagal tone. So many of you may be familiar with something called the vagus nerve. And those of you, I see a lot of people online here who've taken classes with me before. So put some hearts and emojis up in there because I can't see you all, so I can see if you're familiar with what the vagus nerve is. So we know that that's the largest nerve in the body, and it signals the body to rest and digest, and it allows us to have this state of alert relaxation that enables learning, connection, bonding, and trust. When we have high vagal tone and that nervous system is able to do its job, then we have a flexible nervous system that can recover more quickly from stress. We have more nervous system flexibility, and we have a higher window of tolerance in supporting children whose nervous systems may be stressed in that moment. But what we see is for many neurodiverse adults who are in the care of who have the care responsibility for children is that we often do not have that higher vagal tone that we need. So we're more easily stressed or triggered by children's behaviors, which then again can be a part of that co-escalation. So what the research shows us, friends, is that when we look at the neurodivergent nervous system, people who have higher ACE scores, individuals with autism, individuals with ADHD often have lower vagal tone when they are measured scientifically. And for those individuals, it can result in a less flexible and a more rigid nervous system. And that can make it more difficult for those adults to manage environmental stressors, to manage change, to manage uncertainty, or to have the nervous system flexibility that is optimal for supporting children who themselves are working to build nervous system flexibility by pattern matching with our nervous system state. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with this. I'm always excited, again, to see people with the lived experience of neurodiversity to be mentors and models and educators of children, which make our world much more inclusive and serving all. But what's important is that we are knowledgeable of how that impacts. So I'll be vulnerable with you for a moment and I'll share. I myself have received an adult diagnosis of ADHD. And this was long after I was a classroom teacher. So for many of you who are seeing yourselves in what I'm sharing, I wish I could go back 30 years ago to when I was that fourth grade teacher and have a redo of my first few years as a teacher. As a person with ADHD, I did not understand at the time the strict need for rituals and routines, right? So as a person with ADHD, I love novelty, I love change, I love, not to say risk taking, but trying something new that I haven't done before. And what I didn't realize was that what I was seeking through my neurotype was actually triggering students who needed consistent routine, who needed to know every day that we would start the day with a good morning practice and move to homework and then move to putting coats so that they would know that their nervous systems could settle, knowing the exact ritual and routine that would be expected of them. So again, I wasn't aware that the ways in which I was setting up a classroom to what my nervous system needed, busy things all over the walls and a classroom full of exciting things that could pique my attention, was overstimulating to students with visual sensitivities. And so again, what I had to learn was, what is my neurotype? What are the features of my neurotype and my unique nervous system that have a play, on how I set up my classroom, how I manage my classroom, how I deliver consistent instruction and expectations that allow the neurodiverse children that I serve to be able to have a level of predictability and routine that would support them. And so this is the awareness that I help teachers develop so that they again can understand that many times what we are doing or not doing in the classroom can be contributing to elevated cortisol levels, elevated stress levels, and elevated behaviors in the children that we're serving. So one thing that was really important to begin to explore was the sensory sensitivities of neurodiverse individuals. And I find that many teachers that I work with, similar to the teacher whose story that I shared with you before with the ACE score of 10, she also had strong sensory sensitivities. And what we find in the research is that many neurodiverse individuals, as well as many trauma impacted individuals, have heightened sensory sensitivities that can impact their ability to function well in group environments. So that could be visual stressors, like sensitivities to fluorescent lights. So many autistic people and others with visual sensitivities are sensitive to the flickering in fluorescent lights that others are not able to detect or register. Also can experience hyperarousal from overstimulating classroom design. So when every inch of the wall is covered, for many, that is a big overstimulation. But we're taught as teachers, cover the walls, make sure there's lots of primary colors, without awareness that for many neurodiverse and sensory sensitive individuals, that's actually a stressor that can compete with their brain's resources to settle and study, and then lead to undesired behaviors when they're overwhelmed. Auditory sensitivities are another that we see significantly in trauma impacted individuals. The ability to hear this higher pitched sound of the human voice gets drowned out by all the low tones that happen in many classrooms. Sounds of the projector, sounds of the HVAC system, sounds of chairs scratching around on the floor. So many times not being aware that overstimulation to the auditory sounds that don't bother the neurotypical person can again lead to meltdown behavior. So that awareness and collecting a sensory profile, both of the students that you have behavior concerns for, as well as the teacher for themselves, because most of the times we design environments based on what our nervous system feels comfortable with, but not always attending to the nervous system needs of the most sensitive children in our classrooms. Then there's olfactory. Many people now are starting to diffuse essential oils and things in the classroom, usually with good meaning, but many times there are students with strong sensory sensitivities, and your lavender and the things that are being used to support are actually a stressor and not a soother. Gustatory, we see often with students who have trouble with foods that touch and when the tastes overlap, or students that need sensory stimulation and the gustatory to chew. Tactile, a sense of touch. So again, many neurodiverse or sensory sensitive individuals have strong touch sensitivities. So they are averse to having their hands held, having people expect hugs, both children and adults. So understanding that is really important. Vestibular is understanding, again, many times is understood that clockwise spinning activates the vagus nerve in the northern hemisphere. So many times we see students spinning to self-soothe, but we tell them to stop. So then we're interrupting their body's innate knowledge of how to soothe themselves. Also standing or rocking, these are behaviors that are often an attempt to settle the nervous system. But again, we often interrupt children and tell them to sit down. So again, we're not aware that we're interrupting their innate knowledge, their body's innate wisdom about self-soothing. And by interrupting that, we're contributing to an escalation of behaviors when they're no longer able to manage. Proprioception is awareness of my body, where I end and where the world around me begins. So sometimes that can be when people crash in with hugs because they're not aware of their own body strength or connection. And we can be punishing, thinking that they're having willful intention to hurt another, but actually they have proprioceptive differences as part of their sensory profile. So this awareness of neurodiversity and how it shows up as, for some, as sensory sensitivities is important. And then the last one is interoception. And here with interoception, this represents our ability to be aware of our internal state, to know what's happening in my body, my signals for thirst, my signals of hunger, my signals of pain, and my ability to even sense what I'm feeling in my body, to be able to name my emotions or how I'm feeling. So many times this is important because low interoception is common within many diagnoses around PTSD, around higher trauma scores, as well as for some neurodiverse individuals. So that ability to name emotions and to be able to connect that to my internal state and then to reflect that in my conversations with others is really important. So what I'm asking teachers always is to conduct a sensory profile for yourself and then observe how is this affecting how I design my classrooms, how I relate to children, what types of things irritate me because they're grating on my nervous system that would lead me to be more short or less patient with students when they are bumping up against my sensory sensitivities. All right, so this is an important question to ask. So what we ask teachers to do, both profiling themselves and for their students, is looking at hypoarousal. So where am I, do I naturally experience a reduced sensitivity? So I'm sensory seeking. So again, many of our ADHD, students with ADHD have hypoarousal, even though the diagnosis says hyperactivity. So they're actually under aroused. So they're sensory seeking with the movement, with the talking, they're seeking out sensory arousal to stimulate their focus because their nervous systems have a hypoarousal. And then on the opposite side of that, one could be experiencing hyperarousal, which makes their sensory avoiding because they are extra sensitive to sensory stimuli and they're trying to turn the volume down on the world so that they can settle. So again, this awareness of being able to determine when behaviors are actually a function of these sensory sensitivities, both on the part of the adult, bumping up against the sensory needs of the child, that disconnect is where we have the risk of misinterpreting behaviors. So for example, I use this classroom image as an example. Many times teachers I work with, they love to cover the classroom from ceiling to floor and wall to wall. And they think, oh, this would be so great to have so much for students to engage and to touch. But for many of our students with a lot of nervous system sensitivities and certain symptoms in their neurodiverse diagnosis, this classroom would be quite overwhelming. And they do report that it feels overwhelming. So the windows feels like everybody can see me. For some of our students who are impacted by trauma, they feel overexposed sometimes. And then again, with all the things to touch and visual, I don't want to call it clutter because everything is beautifully designed here. But what the research shows is that about 25 to 30% negative space or open space can support giving the nervous system a chance to settle and rest when there's places where something is not filling up every single space. So we would help this teacher kind of think about ways to create about 25% more open space in the room as well as on the walls in order to help the sensory sensitivity of those who are hypersensitive in the classroom. So again, it's always this balance of what does the teacher's nervous system need to feel settled and to feel alert and to feel engaged, and how does that balance with what the most sensitive children in the classroom need? And then proactively designing classroom spaces with the sensory needs of neurodiverse learners in mind helps get in front of the behaviors before they occur. So I'd like to pause here again and take 1 minute of silence to ask you to reflect on this question and take a note. Do you personally identify as being neurodivergent or neurodiverse? And the question here is, if so, how might a diagnosis of autism, ADHD, dyslexia, sensory processing disorder, HSP stands for highly sensitive person, or PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, how would any of those diagnoses impact how you relate to students or how you design your classroom? So please take a note on that and reflect on that. I'd love to see your answers in the chat. I say, Maha, thank you. I would love to engage with you in the chat if you want to put that answer there. That'd be cool. And we'll pause here for a minute. Thank you so much. Oh, beautiful. I like more plants and natural items in my class. I feel comfortable. Thank you for sharing that. Research does show that plants in the classroom, things made with natural elements, as well as a window view to nature or photos that represent nature, are soothing and settling to the nervous system and activating to the vagus nerve, Maha. So I'm always encouraging teachers to consider how to bring the natural elements into classroom design. Thank you, Laura. I'm quite rigid. I've always been. I'm working on allowing noise in my room. Thank you, Laura. So anything that you can do to strengthen nervous system capacity Anything that you can do to activate the healing power of the vagus nerve over time can help support building that nervous system flexibility that will eventually make your nervous system a little more able to handle the noise and the natural rhythms of children in the classroom, because that can be a big component in getting in front of the types of stress behaviors that we might see. Beautiful, Bush. Thank you. Yes, highly sensitive persons. We tend to create rigid or quiet environments that keep our nervous system settled, but it's not always in alignment with what children need. Oh, thank you, Miss Emily, for reflecting. Oh, beautiful. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. It's interesting to see how we need to find ways to balance. Yes, Sarah, please do. Thank you, Lynn. Yes, 25% negative space or open space. Thank you too, Lynn, natural colors and neutral colors. Research has found that the autistic eye settles best when we have like greens, gray blues. And it can be a balance with the sympathetic colors, the red and the yellow, but just not that they're so overwhelming. But most of our classroom design, like if you go to Lakeshore, everything seems to lean toward this idea that primary colors are the only thing that we should have in our classrooms. But that doesn't show consistent with what the needs are for neurodiverse learners. Thank you. I'm seeing so much in the classroom that you're doing. Thank you, Bridget. I have tools like noise canceling headphones, bobble cushions. Beautiful. Thank you. So it's finding that balance so that our own needs as neurodiverse adults and stress impacted adults with sensitive nervous systems can really be of support. So that awareness is super important. Thank you all. I see so much awesome contact here. All right, so that's question 2. So we're going to move into the third and final question, and then we'll move into our Q&A time together. So this third piece that I'm looking at, that I'm asking teachers about their own nervous system state that impacts co-regulation with children, is how does my unexamined implicit bias affect my ability to co-regulate with all students? So this quote, I am a student and a mentor, being mentored by Dr. Stephen Porges, who created the polyvagal theory. And in that theory, he has broken down over 30 plus years, a clear understanding of how our nervous systems are engaged to orient around a sense of felt safety in order to have accessibility to the parts of our brain that enable healing of the physical body, opening of the heart for trust and pro-social engagement, as well as opening and making accessible the hippocampus and the frontal lobe that allow us to have memory, executive functioning, all the skills that make learning possible. But what he says about any type of marginalization is this powerful quote here, and that society, by marginalizing groups, retunes the nervous system, creating a greater risk of mental and physical health problems. And so what we understand here is that these ideas of equity and exclusion and marginalization don't just hurt a person's feelings when they're feeling excluded from the group, but that is also retuning their nervous system, because there are higher levels of cortisol and adrenaline again being boosted when a person is being thrust into a survival state when they're not feeling that sense of psychological safety. And so what we know in the research is that when oxytocin goes up, meaning the neurochemical and the hormone that boosts when we experience bonding, caregiving, and trust, is that boost of oxytocin and care through care that makes cortisol levels go down, giving us greater access to healing, to bonding, and to learning. But experiences of marginalization lead to more cortisol, more senses of psychological threat, then having that weathering effect on the physical body. So it's so important because, I know I'm in the right place with the right people who love children and show up every day to do their best work for children. But then at the same time, it's also super important for us to admit and to understand and to unpack where our physical bodies in our nervous systems hold a charge around the perceptions of a dangerous other, right? So we can address equity from a cognitive perspective of what's right. We've tried to address equity from a legislative perspective to legalize what must be done to give everyone fair access, to try to create legal policies that reduce the over punishment and the over representation of certain groups of students for in punishment and being fed to the school to prison pipeline. But what's true is that we have to understand that we cannot approach equity and discrimination from a legal perspective, from a moral perspective, or from an intellectual perspective. What's super important is that we have to get down and understand how our nervous systems at an unconscious level have been trained to respond and to react to people who come from different identities from us, and understand our nervous system activity around who are the students that soon as they engage in a behavior, soon as they raise their hand to answer a question, soon as they come up to you to ask for help, do you find that your nervous system or your body tenses and contracts and retreats from? And which students, based on different identity characteristics that might be more familiar or comfortable to you, does your body soften and expand and lean in toward with more opportunities for co-regulation, for connection, for high fives, for smiles, for a gentler tone of voice? All of these distinctions in how our bodies show up, both verbally and more importantly, non-verbally, to students is being read by their nervous system and potentially escalating behaviors. So for example, I've had teachers tell me that they feel afraid of certain students. I've had teachers call campus safety and have 5-year-old kindergarten African-American male children in handcuffs because they had a meltdown behavior in the classroom, and the teacher reflected back that their nervous system's response to witnessing this child's behavior was that they felt their life and the life of the children in the classroom was in danger. And when I asked that teacher, well, if that had been a white child or an Asian child distributing that same behavior, would you have felt the need to call campus security and to have this 5-year-old ended up in handcuffs? And she admitted probably no. So, on a surface level, we could look at that like, what's wrong with this person? Who would let a teacher in? Who's the campus safety that would put a 5-year-old in handcuffs? How does this even ever happen? But what I've learned to do when I've learned to unpack from a nervous system perspective is that in that moment, that teacher wasn't necessarily seeing a 5-year-old Black child, little tiny body having a meltdown. Her nervous system was having the experience of all the years since childhood of being trained of who is a dangerous person. And then we're watching the news and we're watching America's Most Wanted and the images that are being fed. She's experiencing, her nervous system was having a reactivity to a full grown man that she sees repeatedly on display of how our media presents the idea of a dangerous other. And all of her subsequent responses of feeling a sense of fear, of thinking her life is in danger, of moving to the action of calling campus security, all started from her nervous system sensitivity of a heart rate beating, a knot in her stomach, a lock, in her chest. And I'm not, trying to say that it's it is a reason, but not an excuse. Absolutely, Annika. But the point is that until in our work, we help adults understand and unpack where their nervous systems hold unreasonable or unconscious automatic danger signals when they are encountering behaviors from someone that they have been trained since childhood to perceive as a dangerous other, that reactivity starts an unconscious chain of reaction that leads to escalations of behaviors that have harmful consequences for children. So this is why we help teachers understand where impacts of age, gender, ethnicity. Many people are, disabled children experience 20 times the amount of critical and negative feedback as neurotypical children. So where that nervous system reactivity to disability comes into play. Other issues around national origin and indigenous heritage we're seeing play out in our culture now, as there's so much political activity around our immigrant population, as well as children and families that are being heavily impacted by ICE and our current immigration policy. So all of these things are playing into the collective nervous system and having impact unconsciously on how teachers and adults are reacting to children. So then the sexual orientation, again, religious culture, as well as social class. So one thing that I do sounds a lot like brainwashing. One is unaware of it, but very yet controlled about it. Yes, Daniel, that's the case. And so that's why what we're doing in this work is helping people make the unconscious conscious and make the implicit explicit, so that we can understand that we are being controlled by many narratives about who the dangerous other is, who the unintelligent student is, and begin to be able to create heart-centered connections when we are connecting with children and adults and parents from other identities. I can't tell you how many times I've had teachers tell me that they are literally afraid of parents of different socioeconomic and ethnic groups in the classroom. So if that fear is in their nervous systems and they're being mobilized into fight mode, the flight mode, or disconnect, they can never make the type of heart-centered connection with that parent or with that child that's going to lead to co-regulation or co-attunement and pro-social behavior. So, but then each time the parent's behavior escalates because they feel disrespected, or the child's behavior escalates because the teacher doesn't give them smiles or hugs or touch, then that escalation, whether that person starts yelling, whether they start fleeing or avoiding school or not coming to PTA, whether they shut down in class with a hoodie over their head, they're going to get blamed for the ultimate behaviors that are observed in the environment. And it's never going to be backed up to have the educator or the adult explore how their verbal and nonverbal disconnects through their nervous system's inability to connect and make a difference. So this is why we have, and I'm going to share this with you in the chat. We won't have time to do it now, but this is one thing that we offer in our certificate program. And what I have educators do is to look for yourself at where you yourself have experienced being a target of marginalization or bias. And then where you might be an agent of acting on bias in ways that affect others and could be potentially escalating behaviors within those groups. So we all have the potential to be a target where we are marginalized on one of these identity categories. And yet, and still, we all have the potential to be an agent of bias, unconscious bias, through our nervous system's inability to connect or disconnect with others where we have agent status. So for example, if I were to fill this out for myself, I would mark target here around ethnicity because I am not white-bodied. And I would mark target here with gender because I am not a cisgender male. So I would look at those two categories where I move through the world, potentially being a target of marginalization or bias, or being made to feel unwelcomed or less capable because of those identities. Then when you complete this somatic survival response, I'll start to look, when I'm feeling marginalized because of my ethnicity or because of my gender, what happens to my nervous system? And that's when I would go to this next chart that I create. I move out of this state of feeling socially engaged and connected. And for me, I tend to move into mobilized behaviors. I get hypervigilant when I'm in spaces where I feel I'm being targeted or marginalized because of my identity. I have a clenched jaw if I'm being spoken to in ways that suggest I'm less capable because I'm a woman, or that I do not have authority because I am African American in a leadership position. So it leads to a lot of mobilized fight kind of behaviors for me. For others, it may lead them to move into more appeasement behaviors of making yourself small, of laughing and joking, of seeming that you're going along to get along, to make it comfortable, to kind of like disappear in the environment as a person of a marginalized identity. And for many of us, we move into shutdown behaviors when various aspects of our identity are a source of shutdown, of marginalization. And we see this a lot with neurodiverse learners. We see this a lot with many students of color. And then we say, see, they don't care about learning because their nervous systems have moved into a survival state. And once we have moved out of this green zone of safe and social engagement, which reflects the active vagus nerve of state of alert relaxation, we're no longer available for optimal learning or social engagement in any of these three survival zones, the purple zone, the red zone, or the blue zone. But for many of our learners, the ways in which they are being related to by their teachers, by the adults in charge, is the true antecedent to the survival behaviors and the meltdown behaviors that we observe and that we end up punishing for. So again, this awareness and this ability for adults to take responsibility for the ways in which their nervous systems communicate implicit bias, both verbal, but especially nonverbal, make a huge difference in student behavior. And so finally here, I don't want you to put this one in the chat. I would just like you to reflect honestly on your own. In your own classroom or in your own counseling program, are the students who express the most challenging behaviors in your classroom or counseling space, are they the same ones who represent the identities that are often targets of implicit bias? And if you find that to be so, then my invitation to you when you go back to school tomorrow, instead of continuing the same course of punishing them, marginalizing them, excluding them because of the behaviors that you see, my invitation to you is to don't put yourself in that student's shoes. Put yourself in that student's nervous system and experience the way that they are being treated from that perspective. And then observe if what you're observing is true, willful defiance, disrespect, misbehavior, or whether the behaviors you are observing are one of these survival states that the student has been moved, nervous system has been moved into because of the types of experiences that they may be having in the classroom, either through the environmental design of the space or the types of relational experiences that they are having. And you will see something very different in many students. And it's this awareness that has contributed to the 38 to 40% reduction in expository discipline that we're seeing in the people who complete our certificate or participate in our professional development. So what we understand and support teachers with in our work is helping teachers build a balanced nervous system that can mediate the reactivity associated with identity-based stress. So again, as we bring in more mind-body practices and supports and work that help teachers strengthen their vagus nerve, build their nervous system's flexibility, build their ability to be less triggered when students of different ethnicities, when students of different sexual orientations are expressing their needs, when students of different religious groups, again, we have this, how would we say, the knot in my stomach when a student of a certain identity comes to approach me or to raise my hand. We help them begin to really understand at a visceral level, we don't have the same open, soft, welcome, and advancing posture to every student and to every family member. And so that is what I'm inviting us all to lean into with consciousness and with awareness. And so as I close, because I really want to have time, I want to help you understand that when you are looking at student behavior, like in the case of the teacher who called security, we don't just start with trying to change her action of calling campus safety on a child. We have to track it all the way back to sensation. When you saw that little boy throwing a meltdown on the floor and throwing things around the room, what was the sensation you felt in your body? So I felt a knot in my stomach. I felt my heart racing and I felt my shoulders clench. Then we ask, well, what emotion did you feel after that? I felt fear. Then we ask, what was the thought you had after you felt fear? The thought was, our lives are in danger. And then from there, that thought that our lives were in danger was what caused her to take the action to call campus safety. And so what we have found is that when we want to change the actions that adults are taking that are escalating behaviors with children, we need to take all of these points where you see the yellow arrows to insert mindfulness practices that slow us down on this train of thought and action at each of these junctures, before the sensation turned to emotion, before the emotion turned into a thought, before the thought that our lives are in danger turned into the action of calling campus safety. We could have applied a mindfulness break, a deep breath, or a question. And the question is this: is this sensation indicating a trigger or a true threat? Because in that moment, the teacher took that trigger of the knot in her stomach, all the nervous system symptoms she felt. She let her nervous system give her the thought that that trigger was representing a true life threat that she needed to act on with so much force. And so we have found that that mindfulness pause helps give us 3 chances to interrupt the unfortunate action of calling campus safety to put a 5-year-old in handcuffs. So our big work is about understanding that mindfulness equals awareness. So many times we, again, are bringing in mindfulness practices for children, but I'm encouraging us all to really dig more deeply and be more thoughtful of the ways in which mindfulness practices, breathwork practices, again, these types of somatic awarenesses, like what I've just shared with you in these 3 questions, help us retrain our nervous system's unconscious responses and become more aware of how often our nervous system triggers are truly the antecedent to behaviors with children. So I'd love to stop there and make sure that I leave these last minutes for Q&A and to be able to engage with all of you on this important topic.
Thank you so much, Dr. Niki. You gave us so much powerful content there, and I could see people making real connections to their classrooms in the chat. Looks like we're going to have time for 1 or 2 questions. There's a lot of questions about the physical classroom environment that we got. So how can I arrange a classroom to be more soothing? And some questions about whether or not classical music at a low volume might help.
Yes. So research does find that music activates the vagus nerve, but it doesn't need to just only be classical. So again, it's important that we be culturally responsive in all that we do in classroom design, in relational design, in mind-body practice, because there are some cultures who do find value and resonance with classical music, but jazz can also work. Instrumental hip hop can work, right? So I believe in taking out the words so that students can really ground down and focus. But there's a lot of great lo-fi. I love Afro beats, when people need more music to get up and get the rhythm going, right? So it's about really having a range of genres and a global perspective that meets the students that are in front of you and meeting them where they are. So same thing with mind body work. A lot of times we have, close your eyes, crisscross applesauce, meditate as the only way to regulate nervous systems. That is a very culturally exclusive model. And then when you have children of culture, our cultures co-regulate, not isolated regulation. So we regulate with drumming, with dancing, with communal singing. And so when you take away those options to help nervous system settle in ways that are familiar to the DNA of that population, then you get more pushback. Close your eyes, meditate, make your mind empty. Then it becomes a battle between the adult and the child when they're trying to enforce or force mindfulness or behavior regulation practices that are out of sync with the nervous systems of the culture of the children you're serving. So
thank you
yes,
for
music is
highlighting that
beautiful,
yeah.
but it needs to have options. Main things is looking at the fluorescent lighting, and some of our teachers are putting soft color filters over the lights because schools, we have budget issues. They're not able to just go out and replace all the lighting, but things that can soften the lighting, things that can create about 25% open spaciousness. biophilic design. So I want to put that in there. A lot of classrooms are leaning, schools are leaning more into biophilic design. It's in the chat for you. And it talks about this idea of prospect and refuge. So you need some aspects in the classroom where people can see out and see far and feel like they have expansiveness through the windows. But then you also need places of refuge because some nervous systems need that feeling of being caved in and tucked in and protected. And especially from a trauma informed perspective, when there's sounds and noise and movement behind me, I'm on vigilance. So I can't settle and focus. So some students may need to be set in the corner in the back of the room, not as a punishment, but as an orientation for their nervous system to have nothing behind them to guard against, but to be able to prospect and see the whole classroom, right? So again, understanding if you have that balance of prospect, opening, spaces for caving and quieting, right? So it's that balance that we're really striking for in classroom design.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Those are some great recommendations. We are close to the end, so I'm going to hand things over to Janelle now, who's going to close us out with some important information. Thank you so much, Dr. Niki.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Dr. Niki Elliott. You really created a safe learning environment for all of us to engage in some very critical self-reflection. And just watching the chat and seeing the amount of vulnerability and authenticity that your questions caused us to pause and truly think differently about how we are attuned and co-regulating in our own environment. Thank you for everyone who joined us today. We truly hope that this session has prompted you to reflect and provide practical strategies to support your students in ways that honor their dignity, agency, and sense of belonging. Dr. Elliott, if it's okay, I pulled a few quotes that our team collected from today's talk. And one is just recognizing that our brains and our nervous systems are truly oriented to be in tune with the physical and psychological safety first. And then after that, the brain is seeking relation and belonging. Once that is all in tune, then our students, we can all have access to reasoning and learning.
Yes.
And how our bodies as adults show up verbally and non-verbally is constantly being read by our students, which can potentially de-escalate or escalate behaviors. So it's that recognition to take a mindfulness pause, ask ourselves, is this the sensation that we are experiencing right now? Is it a true threat, or is it a sensation that we are having? So
Yes.
just thank you so much for your insightful knowledge, research, and again, creating a truly a safe learning environment and space where you can provide this critical information while also helping us identify ways to just be better, do better for our students. So we look forward to seeing you all at our next session on November 13th, Design for Belonging Environments that Prevent Escalation with Dr. Sylvia Mack. And until then, take care of yourselves and each other in community.
Thank you all and for your beautiful feedback in the chat. I'm so grateful to know that this session has been meaningful and supportive to all of you. Take good care.